Hello, this is post-edit audio Mark speaking here. I did struggle with actually converting what I said into enough interesting imagery to cover even half the video, so you'll have to excuse me for this one as it's going to be sort of podcast style audio only, so it might be best just to listen to this whilst doing something else. Anyway, enjoy the topic. Today I'm back with the long overdue second part of my What I Don't Like About Smash Up video. In the first part I talked about the game and its components. This time I'm going to be talking about the gameplay and mechanics. Once again, to reiterate, this is just my opinion. If you disagree with me, that's perfectly okay. I do enjoy playing Smash Up, but it's not a perfect game in my opinion, and there are some things that I don't enjoy. So with that out of the way, let's get started. So the first one, I have played Smash Up with 4 players before, but it's not a player count I ever choose to play at. If I have 3 friends over, I won't be recommending Smash Up. There is way too much downtime between turns in a 4-player game. It takes a half hour to 45-minute game, and it turns it into an hour plus easily. And worst of all, if you're playing against people who maybe suffer from analysis paralysis or take too long to think about their turns, you can be sat there for minutes on end not doing anything. The game really suffers from a drastic change in board state between turns, which means that planning your turn in advance may not always be possible, and your plans may have to change frequently. Particularly in 4-player games, a base might break and you might never even get the chance to play on it. I enjoy the game at 2, but 3 for me is the sweet spot, but certainly not 4, and definitely not 5+ like some people have played. Now while I've said that 3 is the sweet spot for me, it does open up another problem: kingmaking. This is where one person who can't win gets to decide who out of the other 2 players gets to win. I have been the victim of kingmaking before, the beneficiary, and the kingmaker himself, and I can tell you it's incredibly frustrating to lose a game of Smash Up, not due to being outplayed or for any fault of your own, but because you ate the last crisp, or you drank the last beer, or whatever other arbitrary criteria the kingmaker decides to set. I completely accept that this is not a problem in multiplayer games, but the group actually playing the game. However, it's only possible in multiplayer games. Kingmaking cannot happen in a 1v1 Smash Up game. And Smash Up lends itself quite well to kingmaking because there's so much player interaction. That's one of the key enablers for kingmaking to be a possibility. So kingmaking for me is a big no-no. Finally, just on playing the game before I move on to other things, for me peak Smash Up at its finest requires a tremendous amount of knowledge from all those involved. Everyone needs to have a detailed knowledge of what every other faction is capable of, and ideally all the cards in each faction. Without this the game is fun, for sure, but if you don't know that my faction has Full Sail or Hidden Ninja, then you open yourself up to mistakes and misplays, and a competitive advantage is given to the player who does know more. However, if we all know what everything can do, then we can do a competitive draft. Can you really do a competitive draft if people don't know what the factions do? I'd say no. You'd get into mind games about does he or does he not have that card in hand. Players won't make rookie mistakes due to a lack of knowledge, and you have a genuinely high-level competitive game on your hands. This one is probably quite personal to me, and as I say, Smash Up is fun regardless of the player knowledge of the game, but peak Smash Up does require that in-depth knowledge, which unfortunately is probably quite unrealistic unless each player owns a copy of the game. Turning more now to elements of the game, I'll keep this fairly high level but inconsistent wording and complex and convoluted rules that go beyond what the rulebook details. This is an old game now, and it's had many expansions which have added to and built on the foundations of the core set. What this has meant, however, is that the wording over time hasn't necessarily been consistent, and the game has become more complex as new factions, new mechanics, new terms, new interactions have been added over the time. As these were introduced, new rules, clarifications and tweaks were added to try and keep the game up to date, but this in itself has caused issues because tweaking A may affect B that was entirely unrelated to the original issue. In addition, things fall through the cracks, and you end up with a situation today where rules questions continue to be asked, and some rulings remain unanswered, which means that they can be disputed, which is definitely not good for the game. Finally now, and a big topic, are gimmicks, and I've divided this up into 2 categories: gimmicks that add a new component to the game, such as Titans and Madness, and gimmicks that don't, so dueling and burying. I'll start with the latter. Now I really like burying as a mechanic. It's very strategic and it offers an additional layer of complexity and nuance into the game, but it absolutely should not be confined to one faction in one expansion. I get why they've done that, so that if you don't want to introduce that gimmick into your game then you can just avoid one expansion, but it really is a great design space that I'm sure would have worked thematically well with other factions in the future as well. Dueling, however, I think is a convoluted, complicated mess that is difficult to explain, and it really does not work in its current form to the point that I actively avoid cowboys and samurai. Because it is just a free action play, it creates so many scenarios where I have to check back to the rulebook to see what actually happens in that scenario, and also it doesn't really flow very well or fit the mechanic very well, I think. You could play a power boost action, and I'll play terraforming, an action that has no bearing on the duel and is just bizarre that I'm allowed to play it. For me, a far better way of incorporating dueling into the game would have been to play down a minion from your hand face down. That minion's power is then added to your dueling minion, and then it's discarded. It's much cleaner and simpler. Every faction in the game then has a way of actually interacting with the duel, and the interaction is based on adding power, which is probably what was intended by the mechanic, and it's certainly what you think of when you think of dueling. And it also adds a layer of choice. I could discard my king minion from my hand, for example, to give my dueling minion +5 power, and guarantee that it'll win the duel, but are the benefits of winning the duel worth me losing my king minion? The final issue with these gimmicks are that even if the factions aren't present in the game, if someone has chosen Vikings and you're playing with the base deck rules, then the gimmicks may actually be introduced into the game via bases, which is incredibly unhelpful as you may have to explain how burying or dueling works halfway through the game. Now my solution is just simply to discard the base and draw the next one, but it's really not ideal. For the gimmicks that add a new component into the game, I'll start with Madness. I really don't like Madness, to the point that I don't have Obligatory Cthulhu in my collection anymore. I mentioned earlier about why gimmicks were limited to an expansion. Well, this is definitely a case where I do appreciate that fact, and I'd argue that my complaint is still valid though, as it is slightly different when it's an additional component compared to just simply a keyword. The two reasons why I don't like Madness are though that number one, it fundamentally changes the endgame scoring, which I really don't like, as now the first person to get to 15 VP may not actually be the winner. And second, and much more importantly, Madness creates a really negative game experience. And what I mean by this is that on each turn you can play one minion and one action by default. When you pick a pairing, you pick that pairing presumably because you're excited to play them. Maybe you want to try and pull off a cool combo or work towards a particular game plan or game style. You absolutely don't want to be spending half your turn just returning a Madness card to the Madness deck. That's incredibly dull and boring and not why you're playing Smash Up. It is anti-fun in fact, and it really slows the game down. Because I've now had to use my action play for the turn returning a Madness card, I now have to wait until my next turn to do what I originally intended to do this turn. I also don't own Munchkin. I have played a few times with it, but it really just doesn't appeal to me. It just changed what I like about Smash Up too much for me to really enjoy it, and I won't say too much more on Munchkin just because I simply don't own it. And I think that's my main issue with the additional component gimmicks, are that they change the core smooth flowing experience of Smash Up as a card game. It's best when it's at its most streamlined. And for a long time I felt the same about the Titans. I have slowly been coming round to Titans and I still prefer to play the game without them, but I don't dislike them anymore. So Titans as a mechanic isn't on the list. My problem with Titans, however, are the Titan Event Kit Titans. I have two problems with these. Firstly, using Titans to retroactively change the power level of already printed factions is pretty messy and heavy-handed. With the best will in the world, it's not a perfect solution, and the results are that some Titans, like Dagon and Great Wolf Spirit, are completely overpowered, and other Titans really don't make an awful lot of difference to the faction. If the faction is fundamentally bad, like the Vampires or Tricksters, introducing a Titan doesn't really fix the core problem of the faction, or change the appeal to play them. This leads to my next problem with the Event Kit Titans. How was it determined that certain factions got Titans and others did not? The problem with a game like Smash Up is that it's not easy to objectively say that a faction is bad. There are factions widely perceived to be bad, like the Vampires, but reaching unanimous agreement as to what those are beyond the Vampires I'm sure would be very difficult. For me, Werewolves and Super Spies did not need a Titan. I know people say Granny should have a Titan, but again I would disagree with that. And herein lies the problem. It's too subjective and based too much on what you've played and what's happened in those games. Someone may have played one game with Grannies, perhaps with an inappropriate partner, got rolled by robot zombies for example, and now they're joining the call for a Granny Titan. Whereas for me, having played them a lot, they're an excellent partner faction with an incredibly smooth draw engine for the right partners. They are far from weak. Not every faction in Smash Up can be good, and as good as everything else, and nor should they be. It's a power range, and the beauty of Smash Up are that certain bad factions may have excellent matchups against other things, which makes them a really good counterpick in the draft. I also think if they intend to give every faction a Titan in the future for balance purposes, then there will inevitably have to be some Titans that are negative for their faction, with mandatory conditions for entering play. Because they've set a precedent for using Titans as a balancing mechanism, it can't only be one way if they are retroactively applied again in the future. So I think I've covered everything I wanted to gripe about. Again, this is just an opinion piece. Feel free to disagree with me and let me know down in the comments below. What do you think of my criticisms? What else would you like to add? Let me know down below, and I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.